2, 1.
So, to carry on a little bit about Waldheim. I worked as a volunteer for him. I was in Los Angeles and got interested in Mahatma Gandhi and teachings of him, and had some good friends that introduced me to him. And one day I just said to them, like, I love both of you, but I have to go to Washington because the Gandhian urgency of mediating the midst of the arms race between Russia and the United States is so compelling. It's not happening in LA. So I went straight to Washington. I didn't have much. I had briefcase, sleeping bag, suitcase, and the United Nations flag. Incidentally, I read the reason I went there. The part of the motivation was what Waldheim said in the United Nations Monthly Chronicle in October of 1974, that if the nations would just rechannel some of their monies, 5 or 10% at a time, into things that were beneficial to people, then there would be such positive and wonderful results from that they would just voluntarily want to keep rechanneling the rest of it into endeavors that were beneficial to humanity. So that inspired me. With that plus Gandhi, I said, look, I got to be the place where the message is not coming through is Washington, because they're still shoveling billions and billions of dollars into wasted, profligate, militaristic, weapons-producing endeavors, contracts, military contracts. And I figured out very quickly. But another part of it was that Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, was talking about a brain trust and how he was asked to be vice president. He was not elected, but still a fine guy, a smart guy. And I knew that he had something to do with the early days of the United Nations. I really didn't know what exactly. Of course, later I found out that he found the money to buy the tract of land on the East River from the Zeckendorfs. It was a bunch of tenements and run the slaughterhouses, and probably the worst part of New York City. And so they sold it to him for $8.5 million, which he asked his junior for. See, Nelson was the grandson of John Davison Rockefeller the first. So the story is that he asked his father, Junior, Nelson's father, Junior, for the money, and like $8.5 million. So reportedly, the answer was, nothing would give me greater pleasure. That's what he said. So they bought the land. It was kind of a last-minute deal. And then they hired, I don't know exactly what happened. This was 2 years before I was born. They hired some architects, had a competition. Corbusier from France, Oscar Soares Niemeyer from Brazil, and I think it was an American or two, Wallace Harrison. And so they designed this buildings, plural. See, the one thing you have to understand is the United Nations is really, there's two United Nations. There's the Secretariat, which is the permanent part of the United Nations, were the ambassadors, permanent representatives, delegates, whatever you want to call them, come from each nation, and it has a great hall, and they give speeches, and it has a podium. And most of the important people in the history of post-World War II have spoken at that podium. The world's record for the longest speech at that podium was Fidel Castro of Cuba. And so I started off, I went into, my goal was to talk, my goal in going to Washington was to talk to them, to these U.S. senators about Gandhi, and explain to them, you know, a path of nonviolence for a nation, this nation, you know, not to be sidetracked, not to keep being sidetracked by like, oh, we have to keep up with the Russians. And if you read Stuart Udall's book, Myths of August, you'll see how the Atomic Energy Commission came and repeatedly lied to Congress members and said like, oh, you're going to, you know, we have to keep up with the Russians. We have 19 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they have 74. And they'd like fudge, they'd lie, they'd misrepresent, and so they keep this going because it was highly profitable to perpetuate all that. So, you know, humanity, meanwhile, I don't know how many there were then, now it's allergy pollen season here in Santa Fe. So, I went there and kept talking to senators. The first one I ever got a letter back from was Lawton Childs of Florida. He was interesting. He was called Walkin' Lawton. He walked the entire length of the state of Florida. And that was important to me. And also hid an orange juice machine in his office. The guy from Georgia had peanuts. You could have peanuts in his office. And I think the most important one to me was Senator from South Dakota, George Stanley McGovern. And he was Nixon's opponent in 1972 and also in 1976. He ran again, and I was fortunate in late 1975 to go to a meeting where he was talking in some seafood restaurant in Westwood near UCLA, and I got up. I went there and I introduced myself and I said, look, I want to write an article about you for the UCLA Daily Bruin. So I asked a few questions, and then he turned to his secretary or assistant and said, like, what are we doing what do we have scheduled this afternoon? She said, nothing, Senator. And so he turned and says, okay, I'll block it all out. I'm going to talk with this guy. He wants to write an article for the UCLA Daily Bruin. And so as soon as I finished talking with him, I asked him lots of questions, and this was the first senator that opposed he wasn't the first senator that opposed the Vietnam War. It was actually, there were a bunch of them. There was Stephen Young from Ohio, whose granddaughter went to school with at Occidental College, Caroline Young. And so I've asked all the questions I needed to. I said, I think I have enough, and I walked straight back over to Kirkhoff Hall at UCLA and wrote the article. And it was, they said, wow, this is a long article. This is probably the longest article that's ever run in the Daily Bruin, the campus newspaper. So they published the whole thing. They published the entire thing. And then that, plus reading about Gandhi and having these dear friends, this girlfriend and her father, Rani Bagai and Ram Bagai, who was born in Rawalpindi, and little did I know, this Rani Bagai, when Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, Gandhi's top assistant, came to Los Angeles and walked down the plank from the airplane, and there was Mayor Yorty of Los Angeles to greet him, and this little girl, 6-year-old girl, holding a big thing of flowers, the flower girl. So she gave them to Nehru, and all these things kind of said like, you can't stay in Los Angeles anymore. This is just a big bunch of boxes, big cubes, office workers, even the ultra wealthy ones, the film industry, the oil industry, you know, the big buildings in downtown, uh, the people in Bel Air and Beverly Hills and Westwood and everything, you know, they don't have anything to do with what's going to prevent a third world war. Nothing. So I said, okay. So I showed up in Washington and called Rockefeller's office and said, I'm a visiting educator from California. I'm out here at the World Future Society in Maryland, and I want to come to your office. And they said, well, how about tomorrow morning? Okay. That was a big surprise to me. I thought it would be weeks and weeks and weeks. And I said, how about 9 o'clock? He said, well, how about 9:30? So I go there in the Dirksen building, named after Everett Dirksen, who was a senator from Illinois, and sat and talked with Alexander Gabriels III, Nelson Rockefeller's. You see, the vice president has 3 offices, one ceremonial office in the Capitol, and then the working office in the U.S. Senate building, in the Everett Dirksen building, and then one down the hill, and it's the old executive office building. That's the way it was in 1975. This is 50 years ago, so things do change. Not very much, but so I talked to some senators who were receptive, and the most important one was again McGovern, because I'd already established a contact with him by writing this huge article when he was running for president. He wanted to try again in 1976, and he lost to a little-known World War II submarine commander and peanut farmer from Georgia who'd been a governor of a Baptist, James Earl Carter Jr. He lost to him. So one thing I do remember, that's really important to me, was the time I rode in that Senate elevator with Hubert Horatio Humphrey, who was the Vice President of the United States, and he was much smaller than I thought. This has to do with, which is a diversion at this point, I'm not going to go into it, about Watergate, Bill Nixon, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Baines Johnson. If you watch this, you know that I took on some real ugly stuff. Lyndon Johnson telling his mistress the night before the Kennedy assassination, the next time we climb into bed together, I'm going to be president of the United States. That's what Lyndon Baines Johnson said. And this is knowledge in advance, malice aforethought, call it what you want. That quote was redacted in the Warren Commission report. And so we got to leave all that stuff behind. That's 1976. And other people can, determine. And I'm really glad that Trump released all that stuff from the National Archives, partially as a favor but mainly because it was the right thing to do, and partially as a favor to Robert Francis Kennedy Jr., so who is now the USA Health Secretary, and in other nations they're called ministers of health. So I came up with this idea to have a United Nations Undersecretary General for Nutrition, Consumer Protection, and Longevity. It started off in the late 90s, and it was a very captivating idea. At that point, it was just United Nations Undersecretary General for Nutrition. And so I presented it and had spent $50,000 translating that into into other languages, and explaining, this wasn't a nanny state. This wasn't the idea of a, food police following you around in the grocery store to see if you bought a candy bar or, whatever. Um, that's all trivial. That was what one guy, when we pitched it to, I pitched it to the New Mexico Senate, and it passed 31-1, but the only guy that voted against it is still there, the senator from Farmington, who said he didn't want the food police to follow him around in the grocery store if he bought a candy bar. And the guy that championed the bill, Senator Benjamin Altamirano from Silver City, New Mexico, the president pro tem of the New Mexico Senate. Pro tem actually is short for pro tempore, means for the time being. Right now, it's Latin. So that passed 31-1, and then the lobbyists ganged up on it. It's really ugly stuff. It's really ugly stuff. The corporate strangulation of legitimate regulatory processes. Americans have suffered, and Bobby Kennedy is actually absolutely right to say, we have the sickest children in the world, and adults are sick. It's all, when the U.S. blew up the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, dropped these big bombs. Yes, it did end the war. The second one was unnecessary. The second one was entirely unnecessary. The Japanese were ready to capitulate right now, but the U.S. was trying to show test a second design for a nuclear weapon, and to really convince the Japanese that it was time to end the war, but also to show to Russia, like, don't mess with us. And that goes back to the Russian Revolution, and the British. I'm not going to talk about the British right now. The United States had its own revolution against the British, the same house that rules Britain, Queen Elizabeth II, Charles III, George VII, goes back to George I, who was basically a German that was invited to come over and be the King of England. And, you have all those Georges, 1 through 7. So what I'm trying to do, you see, we export all these horrible products, these food additives. Somehow the scientific expert, quote unquote, became, for example, if you are close to my age, you might remember, like, advertisements on television or in magazines. So the guy pretending to be a doctor, an actor in a white coat, a doctor, says, like, Camel cigarettes are the best for your health. A bold-faced lie. I mean, he's paid to lie. And so all the stuff, the expert becomes more and more of an expert. And this is wrong. So, but the victims of all this, I've concentrated on the victims. I like much of what I've done is I should say something about India. India was a great, obviously, because what I was studying the most was the tactics and teachings and precepts of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And so how can you talk about that without talking about India and its liberation from Britain and the precepts that he was teaching? He started in South Africa and brought them to India and was successful. And was killed slightly before I was born, like 24 or 48 hours. I don't know with the timeline, international date line, exactly what to say about that. But so Gandhi made India very important. So I started calling all these different nations ambassadors and called them, left messages and articles. And at that point, this local paper was local newspaper was cooperating. Give nutrition a role on the UN stage. So it's not a role. It's not like an acting. It's not like an acting, like actor gets a role in a play. This is not. I'm not talking about a role. This is what humanity needs is what I proposed, which is a creation of a very powerful new branch of the United Nations that can rule on these things and say, like, okay, Mexico doesn't have to import, nor does Canada have to import anything that's harmful and deleterious. Harmful and deleterious is language that was put together in 1937 and 1938 when Roosevelt started the Food and Drug Administration. And that thing has been so corrupted, from the original concept to not allow harmful and deleterious products. And if you look at 1958, the Delaney Amendment said clearly, of the Act of Congress, you cannot, no corporation, no anybody can add a chemical that's known to cause cancer to any food product in the United States. That's been totally routinely ignored. And this is, we're not even going to talk in this point about the vaccine genocide and by chromosomal implosion, because the people that are going to receive this eventually, the people I've been writing to, the UN ambassadors, know exactly what I'm talking about, because they're from the poorest nations in the world. The US and Europe and Switzerland and France and the pharmaceutical corporations say, wow, let's try out some new guinea pigs. Now we'll use people in Africa. Poor people. They did this with thalidomide, the thing that caused the babies to have little flipper arms and flipper legs. I tried that out in Puerto Rico, and try it out and then aspartame. That's another thing that I'm not going to talk about in this episode. The artificial sweetener that Donald Rumsfeld forced the approval for in 1981 as a special favor from Ronald Reagan, even though the FDA looked at it and said, like, this chemical, we don't like this molecule. It turns into formaldehyde. It turns into methanol, wood alcohol. But he nonetheless, as a favor for G.D. Searle, this corporation in Chicago that made drugs, a special favor from Ronald Reagan to get this approved. Got his own guy appointed as the FDA commissioner in charge of 30% of the U.S. economy, drugs and food. And this was Dr. Arthur Hall Hayes. I said I wasn't going to talk about this, but it's so ugly and so compelling. I'm just going to broach the subject and get to the main thing now, which is what happened with the first UN resolution. I pitched it to all these nations. 55 of them said, oh yes, we'll co-sponsor. So 55, that's a great start. And India was the first nation, I'm sure because of the spirit of Gandhi and because I kept talking about Satyagraha, Brahmacharya, Ahimsa, Hartal, Swaraj, and Karma, that India finally said, like, not the ambassador, it was a minister counselor named Dr. Atul Khare, K-H-A-R-E, who's still with the UN. This is Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations or something. I don't know what his title is exactly, but he's been there about at least 35 years. So he says on the phone to me, well, India, I've checked with all the foreign minister and I've checked with the ambassador and the prime minister, and everything's fine. We're going to sponsor your resolution. And I said, that's great. That's really wonderful news. There are 55 nations that want to co-sponsor it. And he's 55. Really, that's amazing. He said, if that's true, if that's the case, this will be the most successful thing India's ever done at the United Nations. I said, well, yes. I think I called him the next day and said, be sure don't talk to the United States and don't talk to Japan about this, because the United States, Japan makes monosodium glutamate and aspartame, and the United States has all these corrupt captive agencies, as Bobby Kennedy called it, that are captive agencies by the corporate structure. Don't do that. So what he did before the September General Assembly, he did talk to them like a routine list, and the U.S. You'd have to ask him, but what he told me, the best I can remember, was he talked to the American and the guy from maybe third person in the U.S. mission to the United Nations. This was before Rumsfeld was the second term as Secretary of Defense. So he told him, well, this is, go through this list of all these routine things we're going to present. And they get to this Undersecretary General for Nutrition, and the U.S. guy told him, like, does India ever want to have a seat on the Security Council? Yes, of course, he said. We've been waiting for that for 30 years with a billion people. We deserve a seat. And then so the U.S. guy threw the paper on the floor and said, like, then don't introduce crap like this. So when he told me that, I thought, well, there goes a whole year's work. All the translations officially have come to nothing, but the people that got them in the other nations in the process of trying to get this passed, they've benefited, they've learned something. Maybe they won't drink Diet Cokes, or they won't let... Meanwhile, I was writing to Africans, heads of state. Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, the president of Uganda, who replied, I sent him a video about it, Dr. Russell Blaylock's video, and a bunch of articles. And then he wrote back and said, like, yeah, we're going to support what you're doing at the United Nations. We're going to ban aspartame in this nation, in Uganda. Yes, not by legislative decision, just by the executive's decree, an order. We'll close the borders. We're not going to let this Diet Cokes and sugarless gum into Uganda. Well, regrettably, the secretary put a surface mail stamp on it, and I got it about 2 months later, 3 months later. After the UN General Assembly was over, and his intentions were clear, but it was just the mode of conveyance with instead of putting an airmail stamp, this was in the late 90s, and now all this stuff can be done electronically, and so things appear to be moving much faster. They are moving faster because, you know, if I want to tell the truth to somebody, like, Japan's a different story, you see, because with Japan you have the emperor, and I figured that, like, if anybody can close down the Ajinomoto Corporation, which it's the world's largest manufacturer of aspartame and the world's largest manufacturer of monosodium glutamate, it would be the emperor. So I said, okay, I'm going to pack this up and send it off to him formally, registered mail, and I'm going to publish it, and it's still published. If you look up his name, Naruhito, and Stephen Fox, and maybe sometimes you have to add, depending on the search engine, you have to add aspartame or Ajinomoto, Ajinomoto. It means the essence of taste. That's a whole nother diversion to explain, which is peripheral to what this is about today. So that's still published. That was a formal request of the head of state of Japan to close down this entire corporation because they're producing poison and they're exporting it all over the world. They have subsidiaries in France, that's for Europe. They have a subsidiary in Thailand, that's for Southeast Asia. They have one in Iowa, that's for North America, and Brazil for South America. It's a poison. And like Bobby Kennedy says, we shouldn't be subsidizing manufacturers, like we shouldn't be approving having poison in grocery stores. And yet, so that's coming to an end slowly, actually pretty quickly, because he got rid of, in the SNAP program, no soft drinks in schools. So far, they haven't rescinded or revoked the approval for aspartame. And to my knowledge, Uganda and possibly Pakistan are the only two nations that are disallowing it. These heads of state I write to, like, most of them are awful correspondents. They don't write back. They don't say, yeah, we agree, we took care of it, thank you. They don't even do that. But hopefully we can get this done. And there's enough pressure. It's a bizarre situation, because you have the President of the United States that supposedly drinks 12 Diet Cokes a day, pushes a button under his table and has a valet come in and bring him a Diet Coke, which is not good. It's neurotoxic, it's carcinogenic. And I wrote to him, and Betty Martini, whose real name was Beatrice Geller, she started an organization called Mission Possible International, and she only made it to 81 because when she was late in her 80th year, a thug broke into her house and beat up this poor old lady. Lived in $1 million house in Duluth, Georgia. A fierce arch critic. I called her in some radio broadcast the Joan of Arc of the whole stop aspartame movement. And he beat her up and banged her head into the fireplace mantle and the flooring in front of the fireplace. And she recovered from that, and he was in a mask. And I think that he was employed by either the Rumsfeld Foundation or the aspartame corporations or Coca-Cola, which is right there. And this was a brazen woman. She stood up in front of she wangled her way into a corporate stockholders meeting and stood up, and that's still on YouTube. It hasn't been scrubbed. Like the most important things that could ever be presented have been scrubbed off of YouTube. Some pusillanimous wimp that's probably some friend of Mark Zuckerberg, or that's in San Mateo, which means St. Matthew, and then YouTube is in San Bruno, California. But the San Bruno, more of that state, more good things, more evidence has stayed on YouTube. Then certainly all the Facebook, and it's like you're violating community standards to even talk about this stuff. So I don't use Facebook anymore. And I did a lot in the past. But let's see. I wrote to the publisher of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I wrote to both senators from Georgia, and I think I wrote the governor too. I said, you ought to investigate this woman's death, because she was 81 years old. She was too young, and she was being punished for all of her decades of activism. And one of the last things she did was, also in Atlanta, is Children's Health Defense, which is Robert Francis Kennedy's organization. And she sent off a complete manuscript of everything to do with aspartame. It's an ugly story. All the correspondence, she had boxes and boxes and bankers boxes full of, correspondence. She could prove everything. That's why they had her beaten, and then her husband died. He was 94. He was a chemist. They were Jehovah's Witnesses, and not the kind that stand on the corner and ask you if you've ever heard of the Bible. These were people that really went after it, and he funded a lot of her work. And then he died at 94, and then it's Don Martini, and then Betty Martini died at age 81. One of her kids, they put her in the hospital, and then she told me that they were like holding her down, and I said, you got to get out of there, they're trying to kill you. Why are they trying to kill me? I said, because you know too much. You're a threat to the corporate structure in Atlanta, so you got to get out of there. She said, I don't know how to do it. How am I going to get out of here? I said, I'll take care of it. I called the triage nurse. I called the CEO of the hospital. I said, if you don't get that woman out of there, let her go home. You have to let her go home, and you're not going to keep her here. But if you keep her here, I'm going to sue you. Not only that, I'm going to tell all the newspapers and everything what a bunch of scumbags you are. And so they let her go home. And she died a few weeks later. All this stuff, evidentiary timeline should be established. And that brings me to my final point, which is the international courts in the Netherlands and The Hague. There are two of them. There's this older court, which was actually a concept pitched first by the Tsar, Nicholas II of Russia. He talked to a bunch of jurists, and that was about 1899 or something like that. And, it took 20 years for it to be. The League of Nations failed, Woodrow Wilson, the 14 points. We got to read all this stuff to know what I'm talking about. If you don't read it, then you don't know what I'm talking about. If you don't read the UN Charter, you have no idea what I'm really talking about. So, a woman came in my gallery, an Algerian, and with her British husband. And I said, routine, pleasant question, like, what do you guys do? Where are you from? They said, we're vaccine designers from Houston. And I'm from Algeria, and the husband is from Britain. So I asked her, I said, I heard just yesterday that these so-called vaccines are adding propylene glycol, also known as antifreeze, to wrap the DNA so that the mitochondrial RNA or the RNA can't recognize it. Is that true? And she said, yeah. Isn't it wonderful what technology we've devised? So I said, get the fuck out of my gallery and don't ever come back. But I said, but as I recall, I thanked them. I said, thank you for confirming what I need to know. And I became so suspicious of it that I did further research. And then a woman came in with 2 children from Washington State. And she said, my 2 kids don't want to go to school. They want to go to school, but they can't go to school because the school is requiring a vaccine mandate, a card. And what should I do? I said, well, what you should do is get in your car and drive down to Olympia, Washington, and go to the Supreme Court and ask the court clerk there for a form to ask the judges, or one judge, for a writ of mandamus, which is ordering the schools to not have this kind of requirement. And so she said, okay, I'll do it, and thanked me. And so I was so suspicious of all this, and I started doing the research, and I put it all together, and I put it in a box. Letters, handwritten letters to all 15 of the International Court judges in The Hague, and put them all together and sent them off by express mail. I don't know, it seemed like it cost me about $200 to send it there, to get it there in 3 days. The personal letter. So about 2 weeks went by, and I called the court, and I asked him, the guy on the phone was French, and he didn't want to cooperate. It was like, oh, monsieur, you have to work your way up to the embassies, the consuls. You can't just. I said, look, I've sent this box over to 13 of the 15 judges, and all I want to do is talk to the chief judge's secretary, the guy from Somalia, Abdulqawi Ahmed Yusuf, and ask her if the judge read what I sent. Well, so the French guy says, well, you can't talk to her. I'll go ask. So I'm sitting on the phone there with just waiting, for the guy to come back. So he comes back and he says, the judge's secretary asked you not to email or call again. I'd never emailed him. He didn't say, the judge's secretary didn't say, you can't keep writing to us. But he said that she wanted you to know that the judge said, we're pretty sure that Bill Gates is not running around Africa with a shotgun. Okay? On the surface, it sounds very dismissive, like, don't bother us, kid. We're in the big leagues. You can't even step up to the plate. But then I started thinking, like, they do know what Bill Gates is doing. I can't be the first person to point this out to these judges, that this is something wrong. That was and I published it all. I published an article which is soft censored by Google, but it's still there, and it's really simple. It says, the title, look up the title. If you forget everything else I'm saying, look up this title. William Henry Gates III, 2020 equals Heinrich Himmler, 1940. This is on Op-Ed News, OPED News. It's in Pennsylvania, where I have like over 600 articles published. They're still there. This one was soft censored. It has a video headline of the train ride in the late 20th century into Auschwitz. And you don't have to watch that. You can just read what I filed with them. And then they have big warnings like up above, like this is soft censored by Google. So let's see. So
excuse me, darling.
17 months later, the thank you.
You're welcome. You're doing so good.
Thank you. 17 months later, I got what I really wanted to get from this higher court. The higher court is for nations versus nations. But then in the early 2002, 2004, a jurist named Fakiso Mototoko from Lesotho came to facilitate the creation of a new international criminal court. That's the lower court, or the newer court. That's where criminals are tried. Now, to date, with the exception, as far as I know, Slobodan Milosevic was the only Caucasian or white man tried there. Mostly it's a court for black, Africans. Somebody says in Burkina Faso or Congo that they're head of this liberation army, and they're gonna, they killed 20 people, and then so they're apprehended and they're taken up there to court and they're put on trial. and then they're tried in that court. And only until recently, as far as I know, no head of state until Duterte of Philippines was flying in from Hong Kong, apprehended at Manila, put on a plane, sent to the Netherlands, stopped in Dubai to refuel the plane, and put him in a holding cell. And so he has a trial, and what's a trial for? 6,000 quote unquote extrajudicial killings of drug dealers, suspected drug dealers, friends of suspected drug dealers, and friends of drug dealers. 6,000 people. No trial, no nothing. He was actually praised by Trump for doing so, and it's kind of a praise from Vladimir Putin, who was also charged with genocide, but that's another story. And so was Netanyahu. And anybody that knows anything at all about international law knows all about what I'm talking about already. Those are indictments. The way the indictment worked for the pharmaceutical genocidists was the vice president of Pfizer stepped down to become a whistleblower, and his name was Yedon, Yeadon, and I don't know why he did. He had some statements that are on YouTube. I don't know why he did that, but he got together with some embalmers that said, like, we've never seen anything like this in our life. You know, we're pulling out these 20-inch long filament clots out of dead people's hearts while they're, you know, being prepared for. They never seen, and they put them in a jar to save them. So they went to the police and they went to the health ministry, and nobody would cooperate with them. And that was like, this is verboten. That's what the Germans used to say, verboten. You can't talk about this. So they filed a 46-page indictment. They hired a lawyer. They hired a woman lawyer named Hannah Rose in London. And she put together a 46-page criminal information sheet, 46 pages, that detailed everything. Why? You have to look at it. I've been telling UN ambassadors about it. You know, nobody pays me to do this. I do it because it's the right thing to do and because I have to do it to protect humanity. A diaphanous concept that is often dismissed. Humanity. What's humanity? We're not going to talk about that today. So the people turned it in on December 6th, and it was so perfectly done and so meticulously detailed, and the evidence was there. It met all the qualifications and definitions of what genocide and the Rome Statute and the Nuremberg codes. Everything was there. That the prosecutor and the two assistant prosecutors. Assistant prosecutor is from, a woman is from Fiji, and one is from Senegal, and the main one is Karim Khan, who is a British-born Pakistani. They looked at it and said, boom, we're going to put a number on this. The number is OTP, which means Office of the Trial Prosecutor, CR, which means Court Record, 473021. Now, maybe you don't know how to look those things up. You know, maybe they don't put it out there. But there's newspaper articles about it. The first one I read was about 2 weeks later. It showed up, I have no idea why, in Brawley, California, the Desert Review. And that was written by a guy, a two-credential physician. Like, that means he has 2 medical degrees, who's so scared that he had to use a pseudonym, Dr. Justice R. Hope. And you got to look it up. You got to read it, and you got to see what I'm talking about. If you don't know about this, if you're in the United Nations, if you're an ambassador, you haven't, and you don't know about what I'm talking about, then you haven't read all the stuff I've been sending. And I started sending it out in late 2021, and earlier in July of 2021, for reasons you'd have to ask him about, His Majesty and Her Majesty, the King and Queen of Spain, and their daughter, the next Queen of Spain, whose name is Leonor, the Princesa de Asturias, they wrote to me and said, the whole letter was in Spanish, like, it gives me great pleasure to da-da-da-da-da, and, it's signed by the Jefe de Gabinete de Planificación y Coordinación, planning and coordinating. But the important words for me were in English. Stephen Fox, founder, United Nations Santa Fe. So they recognized me. And this business of recognizing goes on, it's very slow. Russia took 50 years to recognize the United States, and they recognized the United States in 1825. The UN and the United States recognized nationalist China, the island of Taiwan. They didn't recognize the other one, the big one, the mainland, until 1974, when it was admitted to the United Nations. I think it had something to do with Nixon going on their trip and drinking Chinese vodka with Zhou Enlai or something like that. I don't know. It doesn't. Well, it interests me because it didn't take long it took 21 days from my email to the King of Spain. See, I called him up at the beginning of the pandemic, got his phone number and said, tried to explain that, I said, well, he's on vacation. He's out down in the Mediterranean, Mallorca, with his family. And I said, well, would you take a message? Claro. Would you? Yeah, clear. Well, what's your message? I said, it's about the United Nations. I said, we need to have a Secretaries General Pandemic Board of Inquiry. That's a formal United Nations language for equivalent of a grand jury investigation. And he said, the guy said on the phone, his name was Ruben. He said, I got to stop you right there, because this is too important and too complicated. I don't want to make a mistake. You have to send an email. So I said, okay, I'm going to lock the door to my gallery. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch. Nos vemos. And we'll see you. And so I wrote a 2,500 word email to His Majesty, the King of Spain, and explained to him, I said, ustedes, para proteger la salud de su nación, tienen que parar los ejércitos genocidios de vacunos. You have to kick out the genocidal vaccine armies. This is something only a head of state could understand. What's a vaccine army? It's a bunch of guys that come in and say, we're going to vaccinate everybody here. And the U.S. has been among the worst. I have a friend that just told me the other day how they went to Iraq. And the Green Berets. This guy's huge. He's like 6'4", probably weighs about 300 pounds. He's a PTSD. He's a veteran, and he's suffering from all sorts of things. But he told me that when they went to Iraq, they would go talk to these like rural Arabs, and if they had scratched up heels barefoot, that means they'd been walking around. They were nomadic, and therefore, if they had to get the vaccine, which vaccine, I don't know. The whole thing is a monstrous pile of crap, and it's total lies, and it's therefore the correct term that I've added to the English language is two terms: vaccine genocide and chromosomal implosion. And before I did that, before I started publishing that, I said, I'm going to call some real experts. I called UNM. I called the medical school, head of the genetics department, UNM, Stanford, UCLA. Nobody could give me anything coherent. So I said, I'm going to call this Dutch guy, Dr. Jan Vij, V-I-J-G. He's the head of the Department of Genetics at Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, New York. And I said, I kept calling. I said, I want to use these terms. I said, no, I'm not your student. I know I'm not your protege. I just want to make sure this is an accurate deception. And by the way, I'm friends with Albert's daughter, Evelyn, who passed away. She was a, quote, illegitimate daughter of Albert Einstein and raised as his granddaughter. And if I'm saying something wrong, correct me. Tell me, like, you can't say chromosomal implosion. That's what it is. So he didn't reply. His secretary called me Dr. Fox. And the first time my whole life anybody had ever called me Dr. Fox. And and I told her that. I said, I'm not a doctor. And she said, well, you're asking more intelligent questions and saying more intelligent things than most of the doctors that we talk to. And so, I took the first 2 pages of the 46-page indictment. I couldn't afford to do all 46 pages. And I sent it off to all these heads of state, like 120, through their UN ambassadors in New York. And I sent it to all of them. And I said, you know, why don't you do the same thing? Like, get these guys out of your nation. Don't let them come in your nation. And nobody wrote back. But then in November of 2022, I saw what I wanted to see, which was an article. It was from a conference in Boston, the STAT conference. That's if you want to, you should look this up. STA. I don't care what search engine you use. I don't like Google because I think they're corrupt. I use one in Pennsylvania called DuckDuckGo. It was started in 2008, and they were dedicated to not tracking you. Your privacy is important to us. So, okay, so I use them. That's what I'd recommend. Don't use Google. So I put together some resistance, objections from these poor nations. And all of a sudden, the CEO of Pfizer, of all the pharmaceutical companies, the most vicious is Pfizer. It's run by a Greek veterinarian named Al Burla. And to think that like 100 million people should trust their health to a vaccine, quote unquote, that comes out of a needle from a Greek veterinarian. What do veterinarians use? They euthanize people. They euthanize dogs, and they euthanize cats. So why trust a guy? You get my point. So fortunately, the heads of state in a lot of African nations got my point too. And the pallets sat in the airport, unpicked up. And the Matthew Herper, Herper, you ought to look this up. He said, what? Is it true, Mr. Burla, Mr. Burla, I don't know what his title was. Like, is it true that 1 billion vaccines had to be destroyed by Pfizer? Yes, we don't understand why. They were shipped to their door. They wanted them. Then all of a sudden they didn't want them. And we had to just ship them back to the genocide injection factory in Michigan. He didn't say genocide injection factory. I did. The corporate headquarters. It's near Kalamazoo, Michigan. Grand Portage, Michigan. And also, that same guy, Al Burla, is on YouTube with Joe Biden. And he's like proclaiming all this stuff, and you can tell that Biden has no idea what's going on, none whatsoever. He's just shuffling through, and because he's been misled. What happens when the leaders are misled? That's what the courts are for, and they got to correct it. So, but then the courts didn't stop the billion vaccines being shoved into the arms of Africans. I did, and the UN ambassadors from those nations did, and so. And then curiously, the guy from the Greek veterinarian, he blamed it on the Ethiopian, the Ghebreyesus Adhanom, something like that. The guy, the Ethiopian, who was the head of the World Health Organization. And Africa, a lot of African heads of state have said, like, the only purpose, the guy from Madagascar, Andry Rajoelina, said, like, the only purpose of the World Health Organization is to kill Africans. So the Greek veterinarian blamed it on the Ethiopian Director General and said, and that guy, the Ethiopian and the Greek veterinarian and Bill Gates and Melinda Gates and the CEO of Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and a couple others from the U.S., plus some British, plus Klaus Schwab. Who's Klaus Schwab? He's the director, founder, got 2 doctorate degrees, economics and engineering. He started the World Economic Forum. That's those guys that goes over to Davos and talk about stuff like this. Except it's very secret. They don't want anybody to know about it. So very high security. You can't go in there. You can't say anything. But some brave. This is on YouTube. You ought to look it up. These 2 journalists. One's a Canadian, and one is from Yemen. But he grew up in Australia. And your search term would be Albert Bourla ambushed by rebel news journalists. And you'll find it. There's a bunch of them. And they follow him around Davos and ask him, like, is it true? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? All he can say is, have a nice day. I suppose, I mean, this is a slow process. Like, it shows what happens when somebody's indicted. You know, they don't want to talk, and they shouldn't talk. And they really should all quit, turn over their assets of their billion-dollar corporations, and give them to the people that are their victims, and then they should be executed. The court has that International Criminal Court has that power to do that, and so it's a slow process, and eventually the court will hear that case. The way it is right now, the most recent development, from my point of view, is what I pitched to them. I said, you know, this is moving too slowly. These are some of the most horrible criminals in the history of mankind. You know, this to make billions of dollars off of killing people by injecting them in their arms, incapacitating them, killing children, 6-month-old children. And you ought to watch on YouTube what Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, said to the senator, the gastroenterologist from Louisiana, in the Kennedy hearings, where the guy from Louisiana is bragging about the 39,000 babies that he authorized and was successful in getting them to get the hepatitis B injection. And Rand Paul says, like, come on, like, what are you talking about? I mean, this is what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, this is ridiculous. You know, the 1-day-old babies, or 1 week or 1-year-old babies, you know, they're not subject to hepatitis B. There's no way that they could get it. So you know, and that ended that. And that, fortunately, that was good because that was the 14th vote. 13 Democrats said no to Kennedy, to Robert Francis Kennedy. 14 votes. And that was the one vote that got him approved as Secretary of Health and Human Services of the United States. So the court's moving kind of slowly. Maybe they got injected, I don't know. But I looked at all those pictures of the International Criminal Court judges, and I said, like, one of these guys has got to sign an arrest warrant for these 16 pharmaceutical genocidists. That's how it worked with Putin. Somebody signed it. I don't know who. Somebody signed it for Benjamin Netanyahu for the stuff going on in the genocide of Palestinians. And we need to find somebody, one of these judges. So I looked at all the pictures and I thought, okay, there's a Mongolian. Sorry, I can't remember his name. You can look it up. But I said, let's try the Mongolian. So I sent a letter to the Mongolian Academy of Sciences and the Mongolian Medical Society and the Mongolian ambassador to the United Nations and the Mongolian ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva. You know, there's another one over there in Geneva. That's the old UN. That's based on finance and money, the Swiss banks. The one in New York got it because of World War II, because of military prowess with blowing up those bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so that power shifted to New York. Well, somebody's got to sign a warrant. And so it was still moving slowly. And then I saw that all of a sudden the civil trial in Leeuwarden in North Holland, in which the judge told Bill Gates' lawyers said, like, you guys don't have jurisdiction because I'm an American. And the judge said, no, the plaintiffs are Dutch. There's 7 children that are vaccine injured, maimed, because of and also Bourla was on trial there too, the guy from Pfizer, the Greek veterinarian. And Gates said, like, you don't have jurisdiction because I'm an American. And the judge said, no, we have jurisdiction because this is a court in the Netherlands. Your victims are Dutch, and this is a Dutch judicial process. So he lost that round. Then all of a sudden there was a big silence about this. Like, see, the Queen of the Netherlands, not the old Queen. That's the one I had dealt with 25 years, 30 years ago, and she's great. Beatrix. And then her son is Willem Alexander, and then he decided to marry an Argentine named Maxima. So he has an Argentine wife. So when the King of the Netherlands and the Queen of Netherlands went to New York, and they were in this big room at the UN or somewhere, and she goes and gives a big hug to Bill Gates. So I wrote to the old Queen and said, like, what is going on? I mean, you know, the Queen of Netherlands embraces a pharmaceutical genocidist, one of 16 that's already been indicted. It gives him a big hug as if that's an encouragement. Like, keep doing what you're doing. William Henry Gates and Klaus Schwab and all that. Like, what's going on here? Like, why do you have the International Court there in the first place? In the Netherlands, you're abnegating the whole purpose and presence of the international courts. Both of them. And maybe this is too big for the criminal court. Maybe it should be nation versus nation. That's what the United States and France and England and Switzerland don't want. They don't want that. So they never another word about that trial. The woman the plaintiff's lawyer, the woman Helen DeVries, Devries, she wrote back and said, like, well, we can't answer your email. My question, like, what's really going on? We get too many emails. Well, I wrote back and said, this is a really important one, because the 33 judges at The Hague, they want to know about this too. And are you impeding? Was there a gag order? Did somebody in the royal house say, like, you guys can't talk about this? Or was it some corporate gag order? Say, shut up. You can't divulge any news whatsoever about, Bill Gates is protected. Not by me, but somebody is. Let's see. So that's the last I heard of it. And then I decided about a week ago, the thing to do would be to write a letter, a proposed draft judgment. I know a lot about this stuff. I know enough to make a proposed draft judgment. Like, this is not the final judgment. And this is premature. They haven't been, there's no pre-trial hearing, there's no evidence presented thus far, but I've always been a little bit ahead of my time. And so, because I wrote articles like United Nations 2020 to 3000, you can look that up, that's on Op-Ed News. If you like it, let me know. We got a lot of work to do before September to get this done, get this approved. And I don't want to have an Undersecretary General for Nutrition, Consumer Protection, and Longevity. And I don't want to have an Undersecretary General for Stopping Child Trafficking based in New York. I want it in Santa Fe. I've created it. I want to make sure it runs smoothly. So I work at this every day, and thank God I have some good friends here, and some clerical friends that seem to understand what I'm talking about, like the Archbishop. And so when Trump, okay, so let's be clear. I sent off a proposed judgment discussion draft, call it whatever you want. But I sent it to a whole bunch of other people too, not just to the court. I want other people to talk about this. So if they agree, they can let the court know also. I mean, it's a peculiar way to look at it, but the court is an exemplary form of participatory democracy. What does that mean? Earlier last year, the International Court of Justice, it had a new president named Nawaf Salam. The Somalian was still on the court, but his term of office was over. So a new guy, Nawaf Salam from Lebanon. And Lebanon's right next door to Israel, and what they're doing to the Palestinians, they know all about it. They're Arab brothers, they're Muslim, they're Islamic. They look with great anguish, and they see like the Israelis coming into hospitals and shooting 12 or 15 neonates in the head. What better example? And I've wrote to all the. But let's just stick to this. What I'm trying to say here, which is, Nawaf Salam conducted hearings in the International Court in the case of South Africa. Thank God, South Africa, who knows something about apartheid and about genocide, started a case in the International Court of Justice, which is nation versus nation. It's not the court versus individual genocidists, it's nation versus nation. And something like 60 different nations participated. And it wasn't just dry court hearings where they talk about the jurisdiction is it a territory? I felt that the most eloquent, clarifying, accurate testimony came from Islamic nations and Spain. United Arab Emirates was presented by Lana Nusebe. And I could talk for an hour about the Nusebe family. It goes back to Ptolemaic times in Egypt. And Lana was the ambassador for the United Nations for the United Arab Emirates, and I thought that she would be a very good person to replace the Secretary General, and so the UN could have the first Secretary General as a woman, first woman Secretary General. And because Anthony Guterres accepted, when Trump in his first term declined to fund the World Health Organization for $800 million, Bill Gates steps up and says, "Oh, I'll give you $200 million." Like at a garage sale, like somebody selling a lamp and it's $20, so I'll give you $4. Something like that. That's but translated into millions of dollars, $200 million. So, and that was accepted. Apparently no strings attached. All then the UN had its own vaccine called COVAX. And they were advertising it. All the United Nations information centers were like, you can promoting COVAX. And so I think all these people are just blundering into it. And I'm not saying that they're malicious. I think the people that were indicted by the International Court were extremely malicious. The ultimate in malice of forethought. So a lot of leaders are very afraid. And the good news is, the least vaccinated nations in the world. You can look this up. The NPR, National Public Radio, has a source. They're on the internet. There are pie charts, there are graphs, there are lists of them. You know, I kept writing to all the poorest ones. They happen to be the poorest ones. And even Gates, when I first started doing this stuff, I called the Gates journalist line at the Gates Foundation in Seattle, Washington. And I said, you're in a lot of trouble. This is before he was indicted. You're going to be indicted by the Hague International Court because you're a pharmaceutical genocidist. And the very next day, he did a press conference and he said, "Oh, the rich nations have nothing to worry about. It's just the poor nations." Back to the old guinea pigs of the poor nations like in Africa and in South America. What are the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere? Honduras. Haiti is very poor. But Haiti and Burundi not only being very, very poor, they have the lowest vaccination rate for COVID. Isn't that interesting? So, but it didn't just happen. The president of Tanzania, Dr. John Pombe Magufuli, who was a chemist, a PhD from the University of Dar es Salaam, got up and gave a speech. He did a test. You ought to look at it. It's on YouTube. He's standing in front of a big flag and a big guy with an army guy behind him with like a general or something, standing behind him saying, "The army backs you up." That's the message. And he gives a speech in Swahili about how he found he found that they did the test. They took samples from a papaya, a goat, a piece of paper, some motor oil, and some other things, and put human names on them, said their age, what village they were from, what province, what county in in Tanzania they're from, and turned them in for laboratory testing to find out, do they have COVID or they don't have COVID? And they didn't, I forget it was, the papayas and the goats both tested positive. So what are we supposed to do? He says in Swahili. We're supposed to separate the goats from the papayas. Something's wrong here. Don't be afraid. we're going to figure this out. We're going to get to the bottom of this. This whole speech in Swahili. Swahili is a mixture of Arabic and Bantu languages of East Africa. It's spoken in about 50 nations. In about 15 nations. There are other African languages that Americans had never even heard of. And big ones like you've heard of Zulu, you've heard of Xhosa, the Click language. Maybe you've heard of Chichewa from Malawi. The one that my friend he lives in Santa Fe, was from Senegal, and we sent some letters. I had him translate from English into his language was Fulani. Who are the Fulanis? They're a bunch of cattle herders that have been there. It's a very ancient culture in Africa, like probably half a million years ago, and nobody at that point 2 years ago, nobody spoke Fulani, so I could communicate with various ambassadors in Fulani. And then all of a sudden, Google has Fulani as one of its languages, and now it's important. And I don't have time to talk about Senegal or the three nations, the Sahel nations, that through the ECOWAS, whatever that stands for, all these acronyms. The U.S. just loves acronyms, and I'm not sure why. So Dr. Magufuli, he was a Catholic, by the way, and in one of his presentations, he has a big bolo of crucified Jesus around his neck. And but a very courageous man, saying, like, something's wrong here. If the papayas and the goats test positive for COVID, and then we're going to close the lab the next day, and we're not going to cooperate anymore with the World Health Organization. We're not going to give them any more statistics. And tell them to fuck off. We're not going to do that. And the same thing about the same time was happening with in Madagascar. That guy I mentioned earlier, Andry Rajoelina, said, we're not going to cooperate with. And so the other African nations said, well, we shouldn't either. So then Dr. Magufuli, his wife got sick. He went to the hospital. He disappeared for a few days. And then all of a sudden he died. He had pre-existing heart condition, 61 years old. This is a guy with 7 children who's doing push-ups on the stage and playing the drums in the stadium for his second nomination, his second inaugural address. I mean, he's being sworn in for a second term. And you're telling me that he has a pre-existing heart condition? That's bullshit. That's a bunch of fucking lies. And I can't tell you exactly, I can tell you what happened with him. I can't tell you precisely what happened, but I can see the before and after. The same thing happened in Burundi, in the Ivory Coast, the Côte d'Ivoire, which is on West Africa, and it happened in Haiti. The prime minister, not the president, the prime minister said, we don't want these vaccine armies here. We don't want them. So he ended up dead. And then in Brazil's interesting. It's a big nation. They speak Portuguese. They speak a lot of Africans are part of that government and are part of the population. And it's a very large place. And as you know, they're destroying the jungle to plant soybeans, to put pesticides on the soybeans and ship them to China. So the Chinese get all this pesticide-laden soybeans. And so the Pfizer told the Brazilian government, like, oh, you really want the vaccines? Well, we're not going to give them to you unless you indemnify us and let us have free reign in Brazil. We're going to, but we have to have assurances and indemnify the corporation assets if it goes south on us, or if we end up being sued or a bunch of people die. You've indemnified us, and we own the government buildings some of the government buildings in Brasilia, which is a beautiful capital. And then most of it was designed by Oscar Niemeyer, who is one of the main architects of the United Nations building in New York. So, I thought, like, they got him over the barrel. That's an old expression. I don't know where it comes from. They have somebody over the barrel. I said, they're trying to get him over the barrel in Brazil. And so I wrote to the UN, I wrote to the International Criminal Court, no, excuse me. I wrote to the judge, the Brazilian judge on the International Court of Justice. His name was Trinidade Cansado, or I forget exactly what his name was. I wrote to him and I said, look, you have advisory capacity. You can issue an advisory opinion. Would you therefore please issue an advisory opinion to the Brazilian government that they don't have to be over the barrel? The Pfizer cannot, the Greek veterinarian who's indicted for pharmaceutical genocide cannot make a demand on the Brazilian government to indemnify the Pfizer Corporation with its $105 billion profits that made in the first year of COVID in the planned epidemic. You can't do that. Would you tell the Brazilian judge on the International Court of Justice, would you please tell the Brazilian government in Planalto or in Brasilia, it's the address for the president is Planalto something or other, and would you please tell him and the rest of the Brazilian government that they don't have to sign this deal with Pfizer, because it's a bad deal. It's a bum steer. They got you over the barrel. Well, guess what? He didn't answer. But then I think what happened, well, I know what happened was he died. He died suddenly. Did you ever see that film called Died Suddenly? You should look it up. There's some trailers of it left on. That's when they pulled the 22-inch filio worms out of the dead people's, autopsy when they got injected with Pfizer. That's a very important film. Before YouTube scrubbed it, somebody paid. Probably the Biden administration. They had a $100 million budget for the State Department to silence these things and call them misinformation. And the CEO of Pfizer was saying that these misinformation people should be in prison. No, I don't think he should be in prison. I think all the Pfizer assets should be taken from them. It is a Turkish, German, USA corporation. It has headquarters in New Jersey, which is in the United Nations, which is in the United States. And that Pfizer CEO has a house in Scarsdale, New York. All of that stuff should be confiscated. And I don't know who's going to end up seeing this. I have a lot more to say. I've been talking for 1 hour and 28 minutes and 15 seconds. I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions, you can write me. I'm Stephen, Stephen, at santafefineart.com. And if there are judicial questions, you should ask the both courts in The Hague, International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court. You have to look up their addresses. The International Court of Justice is a little bit more difficult to communicate with. I found sometimes if I write the library, that's the only one that seems to work. The other ones, International Court of Justice, for the International Court of Justice. For the International Criminal Court, there are 2 or 3 addresses. The spokesperson, the official spokesperson, that you should be asking, journalists should be asking, what is the status of OTP CR 473021? What's OTP mean? I said this earlier. It doesn't mean out of toilet paper. It means Office of the Trial Prosecutor. CR means court report, or court record. 473021. What is the status of that case? Is it moving forward? Are the pharmaceutical genocidists that killed a billion people, are they ever going to be prosecuted, or are they going to be protected by big money interests? You got to ask questions like that. You should send the same question to your UN ambassador. Now, the United States doesn't have a UN ambassador right now. It has a charge d'affaires. Can't think of her name. I'm wearing the purple shirt. Well, this is a blue shirt, but underneath it I have a purple shirt. See, purple. This was the shirt of Bill Richardson, William Blaine Richardson III, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and he was the only one that was ever approved unanimously by the U.S. Senate, before or since. And he was a friend of mine. He was a really good friend of mine. And he advised me a lot when I told him I wanted to have a United Nations branch in Santa Fe, starting with the Secretary General Board of Inquiry about the COVID and the planned epidemic. He said, I'll write the Secretary General. I think it's a good idea. And then the response was, about 3 days later, he called me, Bill Richardson called me. He was also the governor for 2 terms, congressman, Secretary of Energy, wrote a couple of great books. The most important one is called Between Worlds. And he said, Ponce, that's how he talked to me. You have to explain this concept to the Security Council. I thought, holy shit, how can I mean, I've been through a lot of tough stuff with the United Nations and in Washington, not in New York. Never had a problem in New York. How can I do this? How am I supposed to do this? So I decided to make a video. It's an 8-minute video. It's on YouTube. Maybe 100 people have watched it. I don't know how many watched it. It was filmed by a Polish friend of mine, a woman that is really knowledgeable about the child trafficking. So we added that to a second Undersecretary General for Child Trafficking, based in Santa Fe, not in New York. And the United Nations is like big bureaucracies is a curious thing. You talk about nutrition, and they immediately say, oh, that falls under the Food and Agriculture Organization. That's in Rome. And then they say, child trafficking, that's Interpol. That's the International Police. That's in Lyon, France. But how come all this stuff is still going on? They don't do anything about it. And they're quick to say, well, the worst nations are Bangladesh, Bulgaria, Bolivia. All start with B. And then I did some research and found out about Belize. In Belize, there are Francis Ford Coppola, the filmmaker, has a resort. My friend from Belize went down there with his wife. He's from Belize. And they registered at this swanky, prestigious, beautiful resort owned by Francis Ford Coppola. And they signed up to stay there for a couple of weeks. And the minute that the desk clerk found out that they had children, they had their own children, they were looking over the fence and seeing these 12 and 14-year-old girls from Haiti who were they couldn't talk to them. They didn't want them to talk to them because there was a brothel. They were bringing these 12 and 14-year-old girls from Haiti, Dominican Republic, somewhere else, tell them, we'll give you great jobs and this resort. And they didn't, we'll get you a passport and everything. So they bring them over. And then they're used for prostitution. And the Germans and Canadians, he did a little bit of research on it, and I did too. Germans and Canadians fly in on United Airlines, chartered flights down there to Belize City or right to the airport, nearest airport. They probably built an airport just to make Francis Ford Coppola happy. And so the desk clerk tells my friend from Belize, you can't stay here. You have to go somewhere else. cancel your reservation. We'll take it off your credit card, but you have to go somewhere else. And part of it was because he had a black wife. I don't know. You know, a lot of black people it was used to be called British Honduras. So he told me about this, and I thought, this is terrible. And then all these we had the plenary meetings for the United Nations Santa Fe, and I told him, like, I want to do a United Nations Undersecretary General for Consumer Protection and Nutrition. I hadn't added the longevity part. That was going to be the Council of Centenarians. And so we had these meetings at Windsor Betts Fine Art Brokerage. I threw it open to the floor. Like, you guys, what do you think is important? What's the UN in New York not doing that it should be doing, that it has to be doing? What's going, what do you think? Well, 3 women said, one from Venezuela that I barely knew. She owned a Venezuelan restaurant next door to the O'Keeffe Museum, and she's moved somewhere else. And then the other one was from Poland. My friend that filmed the first presentation to the UN Security Council, she sells amber and has Italian and Moroccan fashion and so on in her store. And so those 2, Venezuela and Poland. And then this other lady, I guess, took courage, and she's from South Dakota, from the Lakota Nation, and has ancestors who were chiefs and so on like that. And she says it's missing and murdered American Indian women. So that's 3 women from 3 different nations. I said, okay, well, this is what we got to do. So I asked the woman from Poland, would you write a letter? She said, oh, my English is not so good. So I said, okay, I'll write it in English and you sign it. And okay, so we're going to send it off to 25 UN ambassadors. Let's see what the response is. I should have mentioned earlier that it's actually the United States which has, the last I studied, the statistics was 2019, 450,000 missing children. So the USA is not really in a good position to criticize Bangladesh, Bolivia, Belize, and the other one that started with B, as being the worst with child trafficking. This is not right. So nobody responded. It was like they were too embarrassed to talk about this, or like, you know, we're diplomats. We can't deal with that sort of thing. I'm hypothesizing because they didn't write back. But some things changed, and I mean, my credibility kind of went up. I tried to have these meetings in the library, the public library. The only people that came, one of them was my friend from Senegal and my friend from the Dominican Republic. And Senegal is important because it was the place where the most number of slaves were shipped from to Brazil and to the Caribbean and to the United States. And the Dominican Republic was where Columbus first landed and set up his colonies. So it was nice. It was good to see Senegal talking with the Dominican Republic, and also a woman representing the Kennedy campaign came to sign everybody up to vote for Kennedy. And I previously had never been registered, so I registered as a libertarian. No, I registered as an independent. And then there was another lady from Ireland there that was moved to Denver. So the city council, I asked the city council probably 25 times, could we have a meeting in the city council chambers? Never could get that approved. I said, we're not going to sit in your chairs. You guys, you can come to it if you'd like to, but we're the people that we want to talk to are from other nations, and nobody's going to take away your chair. The city councilor where the mayor sits, and the mayor, I met with him several times about this, and he said, well, he was very alarmed when I mentioned Waldheim, because he said he's a Nazi. And also, he was very alarmed when I told him I was getting good responses from the Russian foreign ministry. They were all acknowledging, they all had the courtesy to acknowledge receiving my articles and communications. And so we're at a kind of impasse here. But we're not at an impasse with the courts. The courts in the Netherlands, I think there's a breakthrough there. I think the Mongolian, or some of them, there's some women judges from Sierra Leone. I'm optimistic about them doing something. Which they have to do, which is you can't let 16 pharmaceutical genocidists be indicted for pharmaceutical genocide and nothing come of it. And it's at the end, just, okay, it's a nice, polite, it's actually a very ugly bunch of stuff. But, it's just like a slap on the wrist. They're like, you're indicted, but, we're going to slap you on the wrist. And then why that news about the Dutch court never advanced anything beyond the report. This is several different nations. Sri Lanka Guardian wrote the most thorough one. And I answered all of them. I wrote to all the journalists and said, good work, stay on it, find out what's happened with this. And so I sure hope there's some questions, and that's the final point I want to make is ask your UN ambassador. If the UN ambassador is getting this video, I'm not very good at sending videos through the email. We're going to try this. It didn't work very well when I was asked to address the Security Council. And Bill Richardson told me, he said, this is a really great distinction, a great honor. When he was there, he said, I only remember two civilians, people not from government one was the Anglican Bishop of South Africa, Desmond Tutu, and he couldn't remember the other one. So I said, okay, well, I asked him, this is a UN ambassador from the United States, unanimous approval, 2-term governor, congressman, secretary of energy. This is a guy that knows something. He didn't know enough to not get the Pfizer injections, so he flunked his survival IQ test, and he died on September 1st of 2023. But he did answer my question. One of the last times I saw him, I told him, I'm trying something new. I want to write to all the UN Correspondents Association and tell them about this plan for Santa Fe. So that's great. Do it. Go for it. And then, so if you have questions, ask your UN ambassador, ask your head of state, and hopefully, Trump had to withdraw the nomination, his nomination of Elise Stefanik from, she's a congresswoman from North New York, who gave some vitriolic speeches in support of Israel. And so, absolving, I don't want to put that word in there, absolving Israel of genocide, that's what it boiled down to. But I'm not going to put words in her speech. Anyway, so Trump withdrew her. So therefore, I've applied for being the UN ambassador of the United States and to the United Nations. And I think I'd be good at it. Last I read on yesterday, news was about 30. Trump said there some good people have applied. There are about 30 people that want to be considered for the job. And I'm just one of them. And I hesitate to say God willing, but you know, something good will come of it, even if they give it to somebody else. I did write to all the U.S. Senate, because the U.S. Senate, 97 of the 100, there's some 3 senators I don't like. And so I wrote to send them all my list of references, which was truly impressive. Started with the Queen of the Netherlands and had the Pope and the Dalai Lama and the President of Uganda and Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, the eye surgeon, who's one of the few people that's actually telling the truth. You ought to watch him on YouTube. He stands up and says, like, we have to stop borrowing money from China to give to the Ukraine. We don't have the money. And the Democrats completely ignore him and keep borrowing money and spending money that the U.S. doesn't have. Like, that's got to end. So, and I hope it doesn't end with your skepticism about the United Nations, because if anything's going to get the world from 2020 to 3000, it's going to be this United Nations system. And unfortunately, it was preempted by Gates buying the World Health Organization for $200 million to serve as a legitimate cover for his genocide by vaccines in Africa. So once we get that out of the way, that's what the courts are for. You know, we can move on to better things, like agriculture, education. And I sure hope there's some questions here. My email address is Stephen, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, at Santa Fe Fine Art. And the courts, the 2 courts, you got to look up there. The library is the way to reach the International Court of Justice. And the spokesperson and the prosecutor, Karim Khan, are the way to reach the International Criminal Court. You can put a judge's name on it. The head woman, the head of it is Tomoko Akane. And maybe she could sign the arrest warrant for the 6th. I suggested to the Queen of the Netherlands, like, why don't you have a big party and invite all these judges over, and it's a party, you know, have a nice dinner, maybe watch a movie, watch Soldier of Orange, a really great film, and see how many of the 33 judges that's 15 from the International Court of Justice and 18 from the International Criminal Court, maybe 12 of them, or maybe 33 of them, no, maybe 29 of them would sign this arrest warrant for the 16 pharmaceutical genocidists. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.